Michel Foucault discovered something the powerful never wanted you to know. It wasn't about politics or economics. It was about something far more dangerous. How you're manipulated every day without even realizing it. And when you understand this, when you truly see the invisible mechanisms controlling your thoughts, choices, and even desires, something inside you changes forever. You can never be the same. You can no longer participate in collective illusions as if they were reality. Foucault spent decades studying prisons, psychiatric hospitals, schools, and institutions. But what he found wasn't confined to those places. It was everywhere. In the conversations you have, in the thoughts you think are yours, in the desires you believe you chose. And his most disturbing discovery? You're not being controlled by a specific person. You're being shaped by something far subtler, far more pervasive, something Foucault called disciplinary power, operating in every cell of modern society. Today, I'll reveal exactly how Foucault dismantled the mechanisms of manipulation that govern your life, how he exposed the techniques that make you police yourself, and most importantly, how you can use these insights to never be controlled by anyone again. If you've ever felt like you're living a life you didn't choose, following rules you never questioned, wanting things you don't know why you want, then what I'm about to share will completely change how you see the world. In 1975, Foucault published Discipline and Punish, a book that began with a brutal description. He recounted how, in 1757, a man named Damiens was publicly executed in Paris for attempting to assassinate the king. The execution lasted hours. His body was burned, his flesh torn, molten lead poured into his wounds. The crowd watched. It was a spectacle of royal power. But then Foucault asked a disturbing question. Why, just 80 years later, did modern prisons look so different? Clean, organized, silent, no more public torture. Instead, there were solitary cells, strict schedules, constant surveillance. What had changed? Foucault's answer shocked the academic world. Nothing had improved. Power hadn't become more humane. It had become more efficient, more insidious, more total. Modern society hadn't abandoned control. It had perfected it. Foucault realized that the modern prison wasn't designed just to punish criminals. It was designed to create a specific type of person, a person who self-monitors, a person who internalizes rules, a person who becomes their own prison. And then he saw something even more unsettling. This same model was everywhere in modern society. He studied the design of a prison called the panopticon, imagined by philosopher Jeremy Bentham. It was a circular structure with a watchtower at the center. Prisoners were in cells around the tower, but couldn't see if anyone was watching. Light came from behind them, making them perfectly visible. But the watchtower was dark. They never knew when they were being observed. The result, prisoners began acting as if they were always being watched. Even when no one was looking, they internalized the watcher's gaze. They became their own guards. Foucault realized this was the secret of modern power, not controlling you directly, but making you control yourself. And here's what really kept Foucault up at night. He looked around and saw the panopticon everywhere. In schools, where children sit in rows under the teacher's gaze. In hospitals, where patients are constantly monitored. In factories, where workers are watched for efficiency. In modern offices, in camera systems, in social media, where you know everything you post is being seen. Have you ever felt like you're being watched, even when you're alone? Have you ever edited your words, changed your behavior, censored your thoughts because you imagined what others might think? That's the internal panopticon. You've become your own overseer, and that's the most efficient form of control because it doesn't require guards, violence, or anything beyond you believing you're being watched. Foucault called this disciplinary power, and he realized it wasn't just in institutions, it was in you, in the way you judge yourself, feel shame, try to fit standards you never questioned. You were trained from childhood to be your own police. But how exactly does this work? How were you turned into your own jailer without noticing? Foucault identified 3 specific techniques that create this internal control. The first technique was what he called normalization. Modern society doesn't primarily work through laws saying, you can't do this. It works by creating an idea of what's normal, and then making you feel shame, guilt, or anxiety when you don't fit that norm. Think about it. No one directly tells you how to dress, speak, or behave in public. You just know how, because you've absorbed over your entire life a set of invisible norms. And the cleverest part? These norms feel natural. They seem like just how things are, but Foucault showed they were constructed deliberately to create a certain type of person. He studied how schools function, not just to teach math or history, but to teach you to sit still for hours, to follow rigid schedules, to accept authority without question, to compete with peers, to measure your worth through grades and evaluations, to prepare you, basically, to be an obedient worker. Have you ever stopped to consider how many of your beliefs about what's normal you actually chose? Or did you just absorb them from your environment? Foucault would say that much of what you think is you is actually a social construction, a set of norms implanted in you through years of subtle discipline. And here's the most disturbing part. When you don't fit the norms, when you feel something's wrong with you, you don't blame the norms. You blame yourself. You think, I need to change. I need to fix myself. I need to be more normal. And so you become the enforcer of your own normalization. Foucault saw this in the psychiatric hospitals he studied. Patients were constantly evaluated, categorized, diagnosed, not necessarily because they were sick, but because they behaved in ways that deviated from social norms. And the treatment? It was designed to make them conform, to make them normal. But Foucault asked a radical question. Who decides what's normal? Who has the power to define mental health, appropriate behavior, acceptable sexuality, valid identity? And when you realize these norms are constructed, not natural, something inside you is set free. The second technique Foucault identified was surveillance, but not just the obvious surveillance of cameras and guards. The surveillance he was interested in was far subtler. It was the constant feeling of being watched, evaluated, judged, and that feeling doesn't just come from outside, it becomes part of how you see yourself. Foucault realized that modern society created what he called the normalizing gaze. It's the imaginary gaze of others you carry inside you. It's why you behave in certain ways even when you're completely alone. Because you've internalized the judge. You've become your own courtroom. Think about how you behave on social media. You post something and immediately start worrying. How will people react? Will they like it? Will they judge? You edit, you delete, you rephrase. Why? Because you've internalized surveillance. You've become your own censor. And this isn't accidental. Social media platforms are designed to maximize this self-surveillance. Likes, comments, views. They create a constant feedback system that makes you obsessed with how others perceive you. And so, you become more controllable. Not by an external authority, but by your own need for approval. Foucault would say, this is the digital panopticon. You're constantly visible, constantly evaluated, and you know it. Because of that, you modify your behavior. You perform. You create a version of yourself you think will be accepted, and in the process, you lose touch with who you really are. The third technique Foucault identified was the examination. In modern society, everyone is constantly examined, tested, evaluated, ranked. And these exams aren't neutral. They create categories of people, normal and abnormal, healthy and sick, productive and unproductive, successful and failed. Foucault studied how medical exams turned people into cases, how school tests turned children into numbers, how performance reviews turned workers into data, and he saw that these exams had a dual purpose. First, they collect information about you. Second, they make you see yourself through that information. You start defining yourself by exam results. Your IQ, your weight, your grades, your salary, your follower count. These metrics become your identity, and you spend your life trying to improve those numbers without ever questioning why they matter or who decided they matter. Foucault called this power knowledge. Power doesn't just work through force. It works through knowledge, through creating categories, making diagnoses, producing truths about who you are. And once those truths exist, you start believing them. You become what the exam says you are. Think about how this works in your life. You go to the doctor, and they give you a diagnosis. Suddenly, you're not just a person with symptoms. You're a patient with condition X. That label changes how you see yourself. It changes how others see you. It changes what you believe is possible for you. Foucault would say, these exams aren't discovering who you really are. They're creating who you are. They're producing your identity. And once you accept that identity, you become more predictable, more controllable, easier to manage within the system. But here's where Foucault gets really radical. He wasn't just analyzing these techniques of control. He was showing that they create the very idea of what it means to be a modern individual. The self you think you are, with its anxieties, neuroses, and constant worries about identity and authenticity, is a product of these disciplinary techniques. You weren't born worried about your identity. You weren't born constantly comparing yourself to others. You weren't born feeling like you need to improve yourself endlessly. All of that was taught to you through years of normalization, surveillance, and examination. And the cleverest part, you don't even realize it was taught. You think it's just human nature, but Foucault had evidence it wasn't. He studied different historical periods and cultures, and he saw that people haven't always been this way. The modern idea of an inner self that needs to be discovered, developed, improved, that's a recent invention. And it serves a specific purpose: creating individuals who self-manage, self-monitor, self-discipline. Foucault called this governmentality, the art of governing not through force, but by making people govern themselves, by creating individuals who want to be productive, who want to be normal, who want to fit in. Individuals who see their life as a project of constant self-improvement. And here's Foucault's most unsettling insight. Even your resistances have been anticipated and incorporated into the system. When you rebel by buying alternative products, when you express your individuality through consumer choices, when you seek authenticity through self-help practices, all of that is still within the system. You're still self-managing, just in a different way. So the question becomes, how do you escape? If even your resistance is co-opted, if even your pursuit of freedom is part of the control, is there any way out? Foucault spent his final years exploring exactly this question, and what he found may be your only hope for true liberation. Foucault realized there's no position outside of power. There's no place where you can stand and be completely free of control. Power isn't something some people have and others don't. It's a network of relations that runs through everything. It's in every interaction, every institution, every thought you have. But that doesn't mean you're doomed. It means resistance has to work differently. You can't just reject the system and live outside it. But you can, as Foucault said, practice freedom within limits. You can find spaces of maneuver. You can refuse to be fully defined by the categories imposed on you. The first practice Foucault proposed was what he called the care of the self, but not the superficial self-care modern culture sells. Foucault was talking about something far more radical. He studied ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, and he found they saw life as a work of art to be created. They didn't believe in a fixed truth about who they were. Instead, they practiced deliberate techniques to shape themselves, to transform, to create themselves in ways they consciously chose. Foucault called this an aesthetics of existence. The idea that you can relate to your own life like an artist relates to a painting. Not passively accepting what's given to you, but actively creating, experimenting, transforming. But how does this work in practice? Foucault offered specific techniques. First technique, question your truths. Every time you think this is who I am, stop. Ask, who told me this? Where did this belief come from? What institutions, practices, or exams led me to believe this about myself? Foucault called this a critical ontology of ourselves, the practice of constantly questioning the truths constructed about you. Do you think you're introverted, shy, lazy, uncreative? Where did those ideas come from? Probably from teachers who evaluated you, tests that ranked you, parents who labeled you. But those interpretations aren't the final reality. They're constructions, and constructions can be deconstructed. Second technique, practice parrhesia. This was an ancient Greek word Foucault loved. It means speaking freely or telling the dangerous truth, not the comfortable truth everyone wants to hear, but the truth that costs something to say. In modern society, we rarely practice true parrhesia. We say what's expected. We perform authenticity without risking anything real. But genuine parrhesia requires courage. It requires saying what you really think, even when it might cost you relationships, status, or security. And here's the paradox. By practicing parrhesia, by refusing to just say what's expected, you start discovering who you really are. Because you stop defining yourself by others' reactions. You stop living under the normalizing gaze. You start creating your own truth. Think about how many times a day you hold back from saying what you really think. How many conversations where you just agree, even when you disagree. How many situations where you perform an acceptable version of yourself. Every time you do that, you reinforce your own prison. Every time you practice parrhesia, you crack the bars. Third technique, experiment with your limits. Foucault believed the only way to discover what's truly fixed about you and what's socially constructed is to test, to experiment, to see what happens when you act in ways that contradict your assumed identity. If you think you're someone who can't speak in public, try it. If you believe you're not creative, create something. If you define yourself as someone who needs approval, practice doing something knowing it'll be disapproved of. Not to force yourself to change, but to see what's really true about you when you remove social expectations. Foucault called this a practice of freedom. Not an abstract or philosophical freedom, but a concrete, embodied freedom tested through experience. You only discover your true limits by pushing them. And often you find they were only in your mind. Fourth technique, create spaces of freedom. Foucault realized you can't fully escape power, but you can create small spaces where the usual rules don't apply, where you can experiment, explore, transform. This could be physical. A place you go to practice something new, where no one knows you and you can be different. It could be temporal. A period of time where you allow yourself to do things you normally wouldn't. It could be relational. Relationships where you can be more authentic than in other contexts. The point is to create what Foucault called heterotopias, other spaces, places that exist within society but operate by different rules. In these spaces, you can practice alternative ways of being, and then, gradually, you can bring those ways back into your normal life. Fifth technique, maintain constant vigilance. Not over others, but over yourself. You need to be constantly aware of moments when you're unconsciously conforming, moments when you're policing yourself, moments when you're accepting norms without questioning them. Foucault called this a permanent critical attitude, not a bitter or resentful critique, but a stance of constant questioning, a refusal to accept anything as necessarily true or inevitable, an insistence on always asking, why this? Why now? Who benefits? Could it be different? Foucault spent his final years exploring what he called technologies of the self. These were practices individuals could use to deliberately transform themselves, not to conform to external norms, but to create themselves according to their own ethical choices. He studied ancient practices like meditation, journaling, and self-examination, but he didn't see them as tools for self-discovery. He saw them as tools for self-creation. When you write about yourself, you're not discovering who you are. You're creating a narrative about who you are. And that narrative then shapes who you become. The crucial difference, Foucault argued, is that you can consciously choose how you narrate yourself. You can decide which stories you tell about yourself. You are the author of your own life, but most people never realize they're writing. They just accept the stories others have written about them. Let me give you a specific protocol, a daily practice that incorporates everything we've discussed. Part 1. The morning critical examination. Every morning, before you start your day, take 10 minutes. Ask, what norms will I accept today without questioning? What roles will I play? Where am I policing myself without realizing it? Not to change everything immediately, but simply to bring awareness. Part 2. The practice of parrhesia. Identify one situation today where you'd normally say what's expected and practice saying a more authentic truth. Start small. Maybe it's just admitting you didn't understand something when you'd normally pretend you did. Maybe it's expressing a differing opinion when you'd normally just agree. Part 3. The limit Experiment. Once a week, do something that contradicts your assumed identity. The point isn't to force yourself to change. The point is to test whether those limits are real or constructed. Part 4. The writing of self-creation. At the end of each day, write. But not a traditional diary where you record what happened. Write the narrative of the day you choose to create. Emphasize the moments where you acted freely, where you resisted, where you created yourself in a new way. Part 5. Connection with other practitioners. Find at least one person engaged in their own struggle for freedom, who questions norms, who practices self-creation. Not to form a movement or create a new orthodoxy, but to have someone with whom you can be completely honest. Foucault emphasized that these practices aren't a final solution. They won't free you completely and permanently, because freedom isn't a state you achieve. It's an ongoing practice, a constant work, a perpetual vigilance against your own tendencies to conform unconsciously. And there will be days when you fail. Days when you catch yourself policing yourself, accepting norms without questioning, performing identities you didn't choose. That's normal, expected, part of the process. The point isn't to be perfect. The point is to stay aware, to keep practicing, to never stop questioning. Foucault died in 1984, but his ideas are more relevant today than ever. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, cameras everywhere, data collected on every aspect of our lives, algorithms predicting our behavior better than we do ourselves. Think about how social media works. It's the perfect panopticon. You're constantly visible, constantly evaluated through likes and comments. And you internalize that surveillance so completely that you start censoring yourself before you even post. Think about how the culture of self-care and self-improvement work. You're constantly encouraged to measure yourself, track yourself, optimize yourself. Steps per day, hours of sleep, calories consumed. You become a data project. And who defined those metrics? Who decides what counts as improvement? Foucault would say these are increasingly sophisticated forms of disciplinary power, forms that make you manage yourself with an efficiency no authoritarian government could ever achieve. Because you want to be managed, you voluntarily buy the devices that track you. You eagerly participate in the systems that evaluate you. But here's the hope Foucault offers. The fact that power is everywhere means resistance can be everywhere too. You don't need to overthrow the entire system. You can resist in small moments, in daily choices, in constant practices of refusing to be fully defined. Every time you question a norm, you create a crack. Every time you practice parrhesia, you open space for others to do the same. Every time you experiment with your limits, you expand what's possible. Every time you refuse to accept a category imposed on you, you weaken the power of those categories. And when you live this way, something magical happens. The people around you start to sense it. They may not be able to name what's different about you, but they feel that you're no longer controllable in the same way, that you don't respond to the same incentive, that you're operating by a different set of rules. Some people will find this threatening. They'll try to pull you back, to make you conform, but others will be inspired. They'll see in you a possibility they didn't know existed, and some of them will start their own practices of freedom, and so resistance spreads. Foucault believed this was how real change happened, not through mass revolutions or regime changes, but through thousands of small, individual insurrections. People practicing freedom in their everyday lives, people refusing to be fully defined, people creating new ways of living. So, how do you never get manipulated by anyone again? Foucault's answer is paradoxical. You don't become immune to influence. You become aware of it. You don't build walls to protect yourself. You cultivate the flexibility to adapt. You don't fix your identity. You keep it fluid. And above all, you practice every day critical awareness, parrhesia, experimentation, self-creation. It's not easy. It requires courage, discipline, and constant commitment. But it's the only path to real freedom Foucault could find. Because the truth is, you'll never be completely free of manipulation. Power is everywhere, but you can develop a conscious, active relationship with it. You can choose which influences to accept and which to resist. You can become the artist of your own life, rather than just its canvas. And when you do that, when you truly live Foucault's insights, something fundamental changes. You stop being a victim of circumstances. You stop being a product of social forces. You become an agent, a creator, a practitioner of freedom. This doesn't mean you transcend society or live outside it. It means you engage with it consciously, strategically, creatively. You play the games you choose to play. You perform the roles that serve your purposes, but you never forget their games and roles. You never fully identify with them. And that critical distance, that ability to be both inside and outside at the same time, is what Foucault offers as an alternative to manipulation. Not an impossible escape, but a different way of being present, a way that keeps you free even as you're engaged. If you've made it this far, then you've already begun the journey. Because just being willing to question, to consider these ideas, is already an act of resistance. It's already a refusal to passively accept what's been given to you. It's already the first step toward becoming the author of your own life. Foucault would say, don't stop. Keep questioning, keep experimenting, keep creating, because power never stops. And if you stop, you'll be reabsorbed. You'll go back to participating unconsciously in the structures that control you. But if you keep going, if you make these practices part of your everyday life, then you become something extraordinary. Not a superhuman or an enlightened sage, but simply someone who is fully present in their own existence. Someone who truly lives, rather than just being lived. And that, Foucault believed, was the greatest act of resistance possible. To live deliberately, to create consciously, to exist authentically. In a world that wants you to be predictable, controllable, categorizable, simply insisting on being genuinely yourself, a self you are constantly creating, is revolutionary. If this video resonated with you, if you recognize something of your own experience in these ideas, leave in the comments, "I choose conscious creation." Because writing that, publicly declaring that commitment, is in itself an act of parrhesia, a small step toward freedom. And if you're ready to explore these ideas further, if you want to continue this journey of self-discovery and self-creation, subscribe to this channel, because I keep exploring the thinkers who help us see through illusions, question norms, and live more consciously. Remember, manipulation only works when you don't see it. Foucault gave you the eyes to see. Now it's up to you to use that vision, not to judge others, not to feel superior, but to practice your own freedom, to create your own life, to never be manipulated by anyone again. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.